What's up, Broncos? Future Nick here, coming live from when we know that Joe Biden has actually won the presidency. Just wanted to hop in to provide some context to you guys that the discussion you're about to hear all happened on November 5th, so please keep in mind that we didn't have all the answers going into it. It was kind of a crazy Thursday. That being said, we still thought these were awesome discussions with some really great guests, and we hope that you guys enjoyed as much as we and enjoyed having them. This is going to be one part of a three-part election special, so if you enjoyed this, please make sure you check out the other two. And with that being said, Broncos, enjoy.
Broncos, and we're moving on to our next guest. He is an advisor for the Poly Post, an associate professor of communication here at Cal Poly, and has covered a variety of political issues as a professional journalist. His research focuses on how the news media covers campaigns and policy issues, and specifically how news norms and processes influence the agenda of key campaign events. We're very honored to have him with us here today to share his perspective on this election. So the Polypod is proud to welcome the Poly Post advisor, Dr. Jason Turcotte.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Andy and Nick.
Thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on. We're just going to jump right in. This is a question we're asking all of our guests. How did you spend election night, and how much sleep did you get?
That's it. So I actually, this is going to sound a little ridiculous, but I'm in Palm Springs, and so I have rented an Airbnb with like a barbecue and a huge patio and then like a hot tub and a hammock. And I was like, I just need somewhere really calming for a full week. So I'm sort of here. And so I can just like shut out the rest of the world. So it's sort of how I spent my night. The barbecue grill was not working though on election night. So that was a little bit disappointing.
Oh no.
So I had really, really dry hot dogs over the stovetop. And, but in terms of sleep, I didn't get a lot. It was one of those like kind of nights where you like fade in and out, where you like wake up for one thing and you're like, okay, I have to reach over and grab my phone. So you're up for like 30 minutes, fall back to sleep. A couple hours later, you wake up for something else. You're like, okay, I have to reach my phone. So it's just sort of fading in and out.
Yeah, I think, honestly, like that sounds like a better night than a lot of people have had even then, because like we've been talking about this with our other guests. I gave up at about midnight. When I saw Trump's speech saying that he considered that he had won already. I was like, all right, well, this ain't ending anytime soon. So there's no point in me just watching Twitter for 3 more hours when nothing's gonna happen. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you probably have done it better than like most people. Certainly me, I'm over here just kind of cracked out in the middle of the night, just like glued to my screen. And meanwhile, you're over here in my old stomping grounds of Palm Springs, just like living it up with a hammock and a grill and everything. So I'm very jealous that you got to spend that. Dry hot dogs aside. Like I'm pretty jealous that you're relaxing over there as best you can. But it's just kind of funny that even then you couldn't get away from it.
Well, I lived like my first election was the 2000 election, so.
Oh my God!
I was expecting this to be a long week, so I was like, all right, I'm gonna get out of town and just try to tune out a little bit,
That's the perfect way to do it. But speaking of being tuned out or tuned in, what has your observation of the reactions of Cal Poly's faculty members been? I'm sure you've talked with at least a few of your colleagues by this point about it. How is the general, because we've already talked with our previous guests about the vibe of the student body, but we were kind of wondering what is the vibe of the faculty members right now?
Yeah, actually haven't talked about it quite as extensively, and we've checked in on each other a little bit, but it's been more in sort of the context of like self-care, like, oh, you're taking care of yourself, or you're finding some way to relax or alleviate the anxiety. And so we haven't really like talked politics per se, but I think that's been sort of the root of the discussion, like, is everybody like looking out for themselves and finding like a calming place or somewhere where they can relax. And I think the other part of the conversation is discussions about like, what is this going to mean for our students? What kinds of questions might they have? How might it affect their motivation? they're going to be more distracted, probably for a while. That was definitely the case in 2016. There were in 2016, we did have students who would need to miss classes for, a week because they were, trying to process what was happening. We had other students who would kind of come to our office and, some of them were crying, some of them were really upset, some of them didn't really understand. I think it's really sort of demoralizing for first-time voters when you see a candidate win the popular vote and lose the, electoral college. And so that's sort of like this disconnect that a lot of first-time voters really have trouble getting like their head around, because it seems on its surface so, unfair and undemocratic in a lot of ways.
Well, that's a really good way to transition into what I wanted to talk about next, because I basically wanted to ask, what have you observed your students' reactions to be? Have you talked with a lot of your students? Like, what have you observed their general mood to be? Because obviously this is not like the 2016 election, because we don't know what's happening yet. So how do you feel that their reaction to this uncertainty has been?
That's a really hard question to answer, because with the online environment, I don't think you really get the pulse of what the students are necessarily going through, at least not as readily as we would when we were on campus. And so it's really hard to know how they're processing it, how they're reacting to it. I think that it's also hard to gauge in terms of, California being a very blue state. And sometimes there's an assumption that there's sort of a dominant view on campus. And I think the politics of our students are a little bit more nuanced than that, and after teaching courses like public opinion and political communication, I think that, and this is sort of, I think one problem with that political parties and campaigns have in general is there tends to be an assumption that an overgeneralization of demographic groups and how they feel. And so, people take, the Democratic Party always takes for granted the Black vote, for example, right? There's this assumption that, if you're Black, you vote Democrat, right? And politics is far more complex and nuanced than that. And so I think that, having a diverse student body in a relatively blue state like California, there's an assumption that there's just this huge sweeping blue wave of student opinion. And I think it certainly leans that way, but I also think that, one thing I find about Cal Poly students is that, I think that our average students is more religious than students on other campuses. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're Republican or that they're conservative, but it just means their politics can sometimes be more nuanced. They have, their views on some social issues might skew left, and their views on other social issues might skew to the right. And so I think that's one thing that sort of makes our students unique is you don't entirely, know, it's not really like a broad brush, or there's no sort of one sort of sweeping dominant political viewpoint. I will say that the contempt for Trump is more visible, certainly. But I don't think that necessarily speaks for all students. It may speak for a majority of students, though.
I think that's interesting, especially that you bring up the nuances of like how demographics are shifting. In fact, we actually talked about that with our previous guest about how, funny enough to some people at least, that Trump has actually expanded his base with people of color, with Black and brown voters. He's expanded it better than he did in 2016. But just like the caveat in our last conversation, minorities still overwhelmingly voted Democrat. But I think what that kind of speaks to is exactly your point, that it's a lot more nuanced than that. And I think people like the Democratic Party taking advantage, or for granted, I should say, the Black community, when we're not a monolith. There's a lot more splits than people would take advantage for, and that goes for all groups. I think for Latino votes, for students, I think that no matter how you kind of split it, my hope is that people see that like there's a lot more, like you said, nuance to how these demographics break down than like I think people are giving it credit for.
That's a really great point, Nick. And honestly, you guys have set me up for a great transition for what we want to talk about next, because it kind of feeds into the conversation that we're having right now. And that's about polls and the both the pre-election polls and the exit polls and how those compare. And also, basically what we want to talk about is what happened and how do you think that this is going to shape the public and even the media's trust in polls moving forward? Because not only in the 2016 election, but in this election as well, they've kind of got it wrong, you know, and obviously that's a more nuanced conversation to have versus how wrong they've gotten it. But generally, people are very surprised by the voter turnout and who they voted for. So, Dr. Turcotte, how do you think that the polls are going to shape up post 2020?
That's a great question. I think like the data is still sort of trickling in, and so we won't really know probably for another week or two, you know, how accurate, inaccurate the polls were. I think that, you know, the polls accurately predicted more support for Biden, right? So if you look at the popular vote, that spread, that gap is starting to grow as, you know, the last few states finish up their reporting. However, there were sort of state by state predictions that were quite off. And in particular, Senate races. You know, it was a pretty big expectation in the polls and also in the news reports that the Democrats were probably going to take back the Senate quite easily, maybe by as many as 2 or 3 seats. You know, it doesn't appear that that's going to happen. My estimate is, you know, looking at, you know, what's left in the races, you know, I think Kelly in Arizona is going to pull it off, and maybe they'll get one of them from the Georgia races. So they'll probably get somewhere around 49. They need 50, of course, with like the tiebreaker going to potentially Kamala Harris, vice president, you know, assuming that Biden holds on to his lead. But there were a lot of other, you know, I think the two issues are, one, the polls were slightly off on some of these sort of state level predictions. And then the other thing is that the polls weren't necessarily off by as much as we think, but what happens is the media amplifies those polls that might be slightly off, and they kind of communicate that to the public as it's going to happen. This is gospel, right? You know, Lindsey Graham is vulnerable. Democrats might get Texas and Florida, you know, and I thought those 3 things were pipe dreams for the Democratic Party. You know, and you know, there's definitely some bright spots for the Democratic Party. I think Georgia and Arizona, even if Biden does not, win in Georgia, you know, that's definitely something that the campaign and the party is going to be excited about. You know, but that's, you know, some of the other sort of predictions from the polls that might have been, you know, somewhat off. Now the public sees as being really off because the media tends to report them without the context and the margin of error and all of that. And so what the narrative has been saying is that, you know, it's going to be a pretty strong showing for Biden, and that all these early votes means that, you know, people are supporting the challenger in this context. And, you know, what we see is they were a little off. And if you just go by what you're hearing in the media, you might think they're way off. But polls aren't going to go away. And the media doesn't really care too much if they're accurate or inaccurate. It's never stopped them from reporting, you know, polls that have some, you know, thoughts, you know, methods wise, or, you know, and honestly, the drama of the unexpected really sort of bolsters sort of the ratings, and, you know, having this long drawn out process. I'm not saying the media wants it. You know, I'm a former journalist. I think that, you know, the news organizations do a lot of good, but it doesn't necessarily hurt ratings, right? And so, you know, no news organization is going to sort of shy away from a really competitive race or the unexpected, right? We love that narrative of the unexpected. The public loves that narrative of a comeback or an underdog. And so it really just, you know, heightens the dramatic effect. I anticipated that this would be a close election. I thought there would be more support for Biden, but that it would still be tight.
That actually shifts us to our next topic that we were going to talk about. Dr. Turcotte, how do you feel that the media's coverage of the race, both pre-election and in purgatory election, has affected voters' perception of it?
That's a good question, and that's sort of tough to sort of isolate, especially in 2020, where we saw such unconventional campaign, procedures. With Biden giving a speech with people honking from their cars. It was almost a little surreal watching, and and then we had these big sort of Trump events in gymnasiums where people sometimes were in masks and sometimes not wearing masks, and I think that it's hard to know how much of a role that the media has in 2020, and it's the same reason I think political scientists and scholars and media critics are going to have a hard time unpacking this election in general, because it's 2020 and we've never had, we're dealing with a pandemic, we're dealing with one of the worst economies since the Great Depression. We're dealing with, a lot of civil unrest and racial injustice. We are also dealing with really, really powerful manifestations of climate change, wildfires, hurricanes this year like we've never seen. And so when you compound all those things, it's really hard to know what part of the campaign is having the most effect, right? Is it the media coverage? Is it the messages from, the candidates? Is it Twitter? Is it something else? I think it's going to take a long time to unpack this election, the same way that 2016 took a long time to make sense of. It took a solid year to really understand what went wrong, why the polls were inaccurate, why, what was sort of this, how was somebody without political experience able to sort of rise up to the top, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of underlying factors. I do think though that, I've heard, news anchors and journalists sort of call this election week instead of election day.
Mm-hmm.
And I do wonder, how much this will be sort of the new normal in terms of, and I say that for two reasons. One is it's clear there was no public mandate, right? I think the results will sort of underscore the division that we have in the U.S., right? No one on either side seems like they've moved a whole lot in the last 4 years. And then the other reason I say that is because the Electoral College, the map or the pathway to winning the presidency seems to be changing. And I think that may make races a little bit more competitive in the Electoral College. And a couple of reasons why I say this is, we keep hearing the Biden campaign talk about the blue wall and, how big of a victory Wisconsin and Michigan were, and these used to be states that were kind of like a given for the Democratic Party, and so they were historically blue states, and even Pennsylvania was a stronger state for the Democratic Party, where we had these union folks, blue collar manufacturer workers who were very much middle class and very supportive of the Democratic Party, and that segment of the population seems actually quite split now in terms of political views. So I still think that it looks like Biden will eke out a win in Wisconsin and Michigan. Pennsylvania looks like a tougher win, but to kind of say that these are big moments for the Democratic Party, no, you're just barely regaining what you had lost over the years. And when you look at Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Florida, these are generally toss-up states. The Democratic Party may lose 2 elections in a row, all 3. And then if you look at what's going on in Arizona and Texas, inroads were made in Texas. Clearly Arizona, we're seeing a shift, pretty powerful shift, I think, in Arizona. And then if Biden loses Georgia, the inroads made in Georgia, North Carolina, suggest the electoral map might be changing, and it may be that these big states, the Democratic Party may may not be focused on Pennsylvania and Ohio in the future, maybe putting more effort into Texas, right? Because they're going to have to kind of reclaim some of these states with the big electoral numbers. So I think that's one reason why we might see these like sort of more competitive, prolonged election periods.
So kind of transitioning from that, then let's stay on policy. Let's stay on coverage of it, because that's something I really want to get your thoughts on. As someone who's covered and focuses and teaches the relationship between like the media and policy for different campaigns, one of the most interesting things that we've seen so far in this election, I feel, is that, let's take a state like Florida, for instance. Overwhelmingly by like 23 points, $15 minimum wage, a very progressive policy, won by a landslide in Florida. Yet Biden lost Florida. So I'm really curious of like what your take is. And we've seen this across the country as well. We've seen sweeping marijuana decriminalization, maybe even legalization in some states, but that doesn't necessarily translate to one-to-one with a Biden win in those states or a Democratic win. So I really want to get your take on how you've seen policy being covered, and if you can kind of explain what you feel like that dichotomy is between these progressive policies that are winning on the ballots in different states, yet that's not translating into like a partisan win for the Democrats.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of almost like a contradictory, statement by the voters, right? Where you see maybe on the local level, sometimes you see like in these sort of blue states, sometimes more conservative, policy or ballot items getting supported, and in some of these conservative states, you're getting issues that might have seen more like liberal getting support. That's certainly a good example in Florida with the minimum wage, right? I think you could also argue that and sometimes we see this in California where it's on the presidential level, a very, very blue state. And then you see like Prop 22, for example, which I think that, liberals were wanted, the gig economy to start, treating their employees like employees. You saw, support for that wasn't really there. And even something like the affirmative action, proposition item, right? Where you might assume that that's going to be an overwhelming wave of support for that in California because, it's a blue state, right? But not necessarily, right? So what plays out on the local and state level can be very different. And I'm not entirely, sure why. And I think that the answers really depend on what state you're zeroing in on. But another example of this happening is you see often, New England states tend to be very, very liberal in terms of, national level politics, but have often had conservative Republican governors. State of Massachusetts certainly has a strong record of that. And so what happens is it also depends sometimes on the labels as well, for at least parties. And so you can see sometimes that like